As I was a-going up Orange Street, I met Captain Edward Perry. There's the young man come join our crew and sail in the good ship Henry. Faddle-daddle-ding-dong, I-do.
You're listening to an old
Faddle-daddle-ding-dong.
whaling song sung by a man who remembers singing it as a child to his grandfather in Nantucket in the mid-1800s.
Or instead of charging you 90%.
The singer's name is James Webb. He was a Nantucketer who spent time on whaling ships before turning to farming. He has nothing to do with our conversation today, except this. James Webb happened to live on Nantucket at the very same time that Anna Gardner was fighting for racial justice on the island and beyond. Who is Anna Gardner?
You know, I always used to teach my students that there were A-level names in history, your Abraham Lincolns and your Catherine the Greats, and they're really interesting.
On this episode of At Home with Authors, Nantucket historian and veteran history teacher Barbara White.
And then you get your B-levels, which might be the Speaker of the House or a Vice President or William Lloyd Garrison. But then you get to the next level down.
Barbara White's new book, A Profile of Anna Gardner, is about a C-level name with A-level inspiration. It is called Disturber of Tradition.
And they're often the people in the trenches.
Anna Gardner had a big impact on Black lives in Nantucket and beyond, and Barbara White has spent her entire career studying Black history. In a few minutes, we'll hear her conversation with Nantucket Book Festival Chair Mary Bergman, which took place in early May. Given everything that has happened since, we wanted to check in briefly this week to see this moment in history through Barbara White's lenses.
I think I always look at pretty much everything through the lens of, you know, the 1800s. But I've been thinking a lot about the parallels and the non-parallels of the time. But I've been thinking about the word risk a lot. You know, people are talking about risk factors and going out with the pandemic, but there's also the risk factors in any kind of protest movement always, and how much risk everyone takes is variable. And I was thinking about risk, and I've been thinking about strategies for change, especially when you're in a minority, whether the minority is an abolition group or, you know, Black Lives Matter, and how you push your agenda when you have to pull along or push along another group of people. And so I was thinking about broad categories that can relate back to what people did in the past. Thinking about before the Civil War, there were stores that advertised that they had non-slave products like free sugar in downtown Nantucket, and people who were abolitionists would only frequent those stores and buy sugar that was guaranteed to have been made, you know, without enslavement. I think this particular moment, there are lots and lots of good parallels to be made, you know, at least as far as activism goes and how you do reach beyond yourself. You know, I've been struck by the marches and the rallies, and somebody said, well, these are the biggest marches in history, and that may be true. It may not be true relative. I mean, there was a march in Boston in 1854 to free Anthony Burns, who was a fugitive slave, and the law said he had to go back. And 50,000 Bostonians showed up to try to prevent that from happening. And you think about the size of Boston, then you think, whoa, 50,000 people, something like that. There was a man here who had been enslaved and was a fugitive named Arthur Cooper, and he fled to New Bedford, and then he ended up on Nantucket with his family, and bounty hunters came over on the boat to take him back to slavery. This was under the very early fugitive slave law. And so legally, he was supposed to be returned to slavery, but Nantucketers, black and white, gathered in front of his house and protected the family. And there were delaying tactics where the magistrate, a white magistrate, Folger, asked the people from off island to read the looked at all their papers to make sure everything was in order. And then the Coopers were spirited away to Anna Gardner's father's house, Oliver Gardner, on Vestal Street. And that was when I think Anna, at age 6, got her first real lesson in activism. Her parents obviously chose to break the law. And I think she, talking about risk, took a big risk. And then, when the Civil War happened and it was clear that, for example, freedmen had a desire to be educated, she took a risk in going behind enemy lines and going into Union-occupied Southern territory at age 46. She could have stayed home and continued to fundraise and speak and write letters to the editor and make her voice known that way, but she chose another route, which was to go down and actually do something. And so I think there's just a spectrum of how people can get involved in any kind of movement. And the other thing I've been thinking about is sustaining a movement. I mean, by the time Anna died, she had seen, all those Reconstruction optimistic things, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment eroded, and Jim Crow and the Confederates were back in charge in the South, and there was just this huge backsliding. And I think that one of the things we need to think about right now is, how do you sustain a protest movement?
Hi, Barbara. It's good to see you.
Mary?
It's interesting. I remember when I first moved back to Nantucket about 5 years ago, seeing a presentation that you and Fran Cartoonin were giving at the African Meeting House. And I think it must have been about this topic, or maybe the beginning of this topic, or maybe you were talking about Cyrus Pierce.
Could have been. I mean, Fran and I, we were on the Friends of the African Meeting House, and so any kind of topic that relates to the African Meeting House, we're always available.
The one thing that I remember in watching that presentation was what a great presenter that you were and speaker that you were, because it's not easy to be a researcher and a historian and also to deliver that in a way that's accessible.
Well,
and engaging.
That I taught middle school. You have to make it clear to middle schoolers. And I also am married to a theater man, a drama teacher, so I think there's some influence there. Mark and I worked with the drama club at the high school for 20 years, so a little bit of that.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed reading about Anna's story, and I kind of wondered, just how did you first become interested in Anna Gardner? As Michael had mentioned when we were chatting before, that it's not a name that a lot of people know. It's not a Lucretia Mott, but she certainly has her place in history.
Yeah, I started getting interested in Anna in the late 70s. I was a student at Boston University's African American Studies program, and I needed to do a thesis. And because I was commuting back and forth as best I could from Nantucket, I wanted a Nantucket topic. And so I began casting a wide net, finding what Black history there was on Nantucket. And it became evident pretty clearly that it was the pre-Civil War era. And so I began searching, and I came across an article in the Inky about petitions that had been sent from the island, and there was nothing else about them. And then the blizzard of 1978 hit, and Boston closed down. I was in Boston, so as things began opening up, but school had not yet opened, I went to the State House, and I sat there, as where the archives were at the time, and I asked the woman on duty if there were any petitions from Nantucket in the 1840s, and she said, well, you need to know the month and you need to know the committee. Well, I had no clue, and so I thought, well, there are several ways to skin this cat, being a researcher, so I began just filling out every committee, every month I could think of for a big span of time, and she wasn't particularly happy. And then she went on lunch, and this is what happens in history and digging. She went on lunch, and a man came in, and he said, well, what are you doing, little lady? And I said, well, I'm looking for, 70s, looking for these petitions that I think, I have a hunch, were sent here from Nantucket. And so he said, well, would you like to go down into the archives? And I said, absolutely. So we went down into the vaults that now are at Columbia Point, but there were these just rows and rows of these steel bookcases, very high up to the ceiling. And he reached up and he pulled out, he said, well, let's start with the Education Committee. I said, sounds good. So he pulled out this box, and underneath the box that had never been properly filed, 7 petitions fell to the floor. They had never been put in the box properly. And so I leaned over to pick them up, and just chills, serendipity, as this long row of, people back then when they signed petitions often signed them in a long line so that they looked more impressive. You reeled out this long list, and all the Nantucket names just popped out at me, the Starbucks and the Coffins and the Gardners and the Folgers. And I knew that right then and there that I discovered the petitions. It was such a significant find because it linked my hunch about a law ensuring equal education that I called my professor immediately, and he immediately got me a Rockefeller grant. And they decided they would publish my petition. So, and that's when I came across all of these names and movers and shakers who became abolitionists. And it's interesting you mentioned Lucretia Mott, because I always used to teach my students that there were A-level names in history, your Abraham Lincolns and your Catherine the Greats, and they're really interesting. And then you get your B-levels, which might be the Speaker of the House or a Vice President or William Lloyd Garrison. But then you get to the next level down. And they're often the people in the trenches, but they're more than the people in the trenches because they take leadership roles, possibly in a region or whatever. And Anna Gardner was one of those. She at the time was probably almost as famous as Lucretia Mott. She just, like a lot of people, they get lost in history. And, I hope my book will remedy that. So there you go. Short.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, that's a really great story. And I just love, as I've been thinking about doing my own work online, and the Registry of Deeds is closed and I can only do so much as a historian, and how it's wonderful that so many things are digitized, but working in the digital world, you lose that aspect of serendipity.
Truly.
A lot of it. You don't see what's on the next page of the newspaper if you're doing a really targeted search. And
yeah, it's very true.
Interesting what you've described. Now, I'm wondering, is this the first biography that you've written?
No, it's the second.
Oh, okay.
Biographies are hard.
How is that writing a regular history?
Well, when I wrote A Line in the Sand, it's a story. It's a very clear beginning, middle, end. Segregation, the struggle, integration at the end. And so it follows an arc. A person's life doesn't follow such an arc. And the primary sources for both my first biography, which was Cyrus Peirce, and then Anna Gardner, although there's a fair amount of primary source material, neither of them left personal journals, diaries, letters. There are a few I found of both of them. So it was really hard. And both biographies took me about 12 years. I can't say I did them nonstop, but kind of in the back of my mind. My husband and I, because I retired early, partly to pursue these, we went to every place both of them lived, and tried to spend at least 4 or 5 days in each place, and going to the primary source material or the local newspapers that you can't always find even at the Antiquarian Society in Worcester, which has lots of them. So a biography is hard. So I try, because I'm a storyteller, I try to go from story to story to story and then link them together. It's not always easy, but I will never write another biography. I'm sworn to that.
Well, now it's on tape, so I guess.
I'm never writing another biography. I'm running out of years. I'm 70 years old. 12 years to write a biography is just I don't think I have the time. I do have few people I would love to write about, but I think I will.
Yeah, who would you write about?
Well, one I would, Phoebe Ann Hannaford, who was a Nantucketer, and also maybe someone in the the Eunice Ross's family, there was a man named John Gardner Ross, clearly taking a Gardner name, and he became a missionary down in Florida and New Haven, was a man of color. He's always intrigued me. William Foster Mitchell, Mariah Mitchell's brother, who was also an abolitionist and taught in Quaker schools for the freedmen. They're all good.
Yeah. Do you feel like these are people that you know?
Absolutely. And, walking around Nantucket, especially in the winters, and of course people walked back then. When I walk around Nantucket in the dead of winter, I can feel their presence. It sounds silly, but sometimes
it does not sound silly to me.
when I read both Anna and Cyrus about their feelings about teaching, I feel like if they could reincarnate and come to a faculty meeting, they would be right there. The issues they discussed back then, hands-on versus rote, child-centered versus teacher-centered, how do you teach vocabulary? They discussed all those issues. They could easily transport to the 2000s and fit right into a faculty meeting. So issues don't really go away.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Anna was aware of the moment that she was living through, or were people just more thoughtful about saving their correspondences in their lives?
No, I think she was very well aware of the momentous of the times. I think that the racism and the strictures put on women weighed on her heavily, and she was aware of them from such a young age 6. Her mother had Absalom Boston, Nantucket whale captain, black man of color, in her house. I think Anna was very well aware of the moment and wanted to be a part of it. She was truly what historians at that era called universal reformer. So she had her fingers in, voting rights, women's rights, black rights, temperance, and Unitarianism. So I think she was very well aware. She wasn't very good about keeping her personal correspondence. She kept files and files of her speeches. She wrote lots of speeches, from William of Orange to the role of women in politics to teaching in the South to Spinoza. But, she corresponded with Frederick Douglass. He was famous. She knew he was famous. There's not any of his correspondence. She corresponded with Lucy Stone, the women's suffrage / abolitionist. Nothing exists. She undoubtedly corresponded with Mariah Mitchell. None of that did she keep. So I think she was maybe rather private when it came to the private stuff, which is to my chagrin. So you have to read between the lines a lot.
Sure. And is it fair to say that there was more of a separation between the personal and the political?
I think that's possible. I mean, she was rather prim and proper in some ways. And I mean, the treasure trove I got to see a personal Anna was when she was living in Charlottesville, which was in 1866 or 1871, when she was there to start a school for freedmen. And she was there, she went alone. She was given the responsibility of starting a school from the ground up. And she wrote letters. That there are a fair amount of letters to the Freedmen's Journal, which was a newspaper put out by the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, and you do see Anna in those. But she roomed with, another white teacher who went down there was named Felina Karkin from Tingsboro, Massachusetts, and Felina kept a journal. And from the journal, you can really get to see the real Anna. And so a lot of the things I have discovered about her in a personal way, I actually get from Felina.
So the lesson to those of us out there is to even if we don't write it, somebody else might be writing it about us.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting. I've just been thinking a lot about Nantucket, I suppose because I haven't been able to leave Nantucket during this moment in time. And I'm wondering, what do you think that Anna would have done during this moment? It seemed like towards the end of her life that she had been ill and she had been homebound.
I And I think
Do you
throughout
feel,
her life, she was often very alone. She was in the South for a dozen years, and pretty much she was there alone in many of her in her living circumstance. She owned two houses on Nantucket at various times, which she owned alone, although there was family around her and friends. I don't think solitude was difficult for her. She read, she wrote, she walked, she gardened. I think she would have done all of those things during this time and not really had too much difficulty. Although she did complain about being island bound, and she made it her mission, even as an much older woman, not to feel bound by Nantucket. And so even just before her death, months before her death, she went up to Boston. She also wrote for the Women's Journal in Boston, and she went up to their offices. And 2 years before she died, she went to a rally against lynching. So she tried not, in Boston, she tried not to let Nantucket become too much of a barrier to her leaving.
so when you were going to school in the 1970s, living on Nantucket, were you teaching at the same time?
Yes, well, no, I had a sabbatical to
Okay.
get my master's degree, and so I had 9 months to get my master's, and
Oh my God.
small children at home, so it was a challenge. I look back and think you could only do that in your 20s. But yeah, it was a really fascinating time. The African American Studies program at Boston University was very small. There were about 9 of us, and it was a real privilege for me to go there. There was another white person in the program, and I was constantly queried, why are you taking this program? And it was a no-brainer for me. I was teaching American history predominantly on Nantucket. I was teaching in the high school at the time, and and I knew this from my undergraduate degree as well. I had a very dynamic, progressive professor at Marietta College in Ohio who constantly taught the non-white side of history. And so I had that framework in my head. And so I felt like, I know the white history. I don't know the black history enough. So that's where I need to go. And so, and I have concluded, as have many people, that truly the history of America, at least a huge lens of it, is a history of race. And so I've never regretted it for a minute. And it was, fascinating because I was part of the program. We went into black churches. I did volunteer work at the Harriet Tubman Settlement House. I went in and taught in predominantly black high schools for a bit in Boston as part of the program. And I always felt I was admitted to a very welcoming community. And, it was really fun.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's really important for people to have moments in their lives where they experience what it feels like to be in the minority.
Yeah. And it was not always in my comfort zone, and of course being in the classroom isn't always in your comfort zone. So it's an okay place to be at times.
Yeah. They say, that's where you change and grow, is to be able to through that. We're just not used to being uncomfortable, a lot of us.
It changed my life. It changed my life. Had I not discovered the Nantucket story with our role in the integrating the schools, I would have still continued in the same direction. This one gave me Nantucket as a base, whereas who knows, maybe I would have done more off-island research.
Are you from Nantucket?
Nope.
How did you end up here?
It was the end of the Vietnam War. There weren't a lot of jobs, and so I took a job when it opened. And at the time when I came here, there were a lot of openings because it was a much quieter community. A lot of single people did not stay. There was no movie theater back then. There were like 2 restaurants open, and so there were a lot of openings. So I grabbed it, and that was it.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. It's just interesting to think too about how Nantucket historically and Nantucket today, and how the diversity on the island has always been there, and that those stories are Nantucket history.
Yeah.
Stories of people that didn't have Quaker last names. And I wonder too, you must have seen a lot of change when you were teaching in the school system.
Oh,
of the
yeah.
students that were
For
coming through
sure.
there, and how your background helped
Yeah.
shape or gave you the tools to to reach students.
Well, I mean, my mom was an immigrant. I was raised in a very open way, progressive way. So certainly my childhood set me up for that as well. And I always wanted to be a teacher. Nantucket was definitely working white community mostly when I got here. When I began to study the Black history a few years later, I tried to trace some of the local Black families back, only to find out they did not go back into the period that I was studying. That the more recent African Americans came later, during cranberries or whatever, a later time period. So that was always a bit of a dead end. But certainly we've seen the diversity grow, particularly with an immigrant community here. I think when I first started teaching, there probably wasn't a single Hispanic family in the school system. Certainly English as a second language wasn't anything you particularly thought about. So being a lot of change. And for the most part, I think we embrace it. It's so healthy, watching the drama, working in the theater at the school, bringing in everybody that we could to play the parts. So yeah, it's been challenges for the system, but good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know people who, were living in Connecticut and came here for work and decided to stay because they wanted their kids to be able to go to a school that was so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
To get to, go to a birthday party and come home with pupusas, or
Yep.
learn how to make different foods, and just so I think it's one of our community's best assets.
It is, but we can't be complacent about it, because I know, like, when I go to the school sometimes and I still see a lot of self-segregation, or who knows how much self it is when you go to the cafeteria. It's something we can never, ever stop addressing, is making connections and the bridges and the commonality. And, we fool ourselves if we think that the racism doesn't exist. So we have to also keep working on it. Oh, as Anna
Do you have an idea of how the communities historically were integrated or not? I just mean, I guess, socially, or
there was definitely segregation. I don't think it was not enforced by law, other than the school system. The Five Corners neighborhood called New Guinea. Most of the African American families lived there, not entirely. And when the Irish came in, a lot of the Irish lived in the same neighborhood. And interestingly enough, there was intermarriage. A woman named Susan Kelly married one of the Pompeys. And so there was that. So, and it depends on the time period. But before the Civil War, we had, close to 600 African Americans living here. And so it was a presence. And there were barbershops on Main Street, not just in the African American community. So there was always some mixing. Certainly the Unitarian Church, or the Second Congregational Church before that, which evolved into the Unitarians, was a place where, before there were Black churches here, performed some of the marriages and things like that. So, and whale ships were relatively integrated, although not a whole lot of people of color rose to high ranks, especially on ships that were white owned. There were some, Black captains, but few and far between, too, from Nantucket that we know of.
So what are some misconceptions about Black history on Nantucket?
Well, I think, first of all, there was for a long time, and it was institutionalized for a long time, that there was, we focus on our whaling history. If you go back to even when I first got here in the early 70s, I came in 71. The Whaling Museum was pretty much, the whaling museum. And it took, time before people like me and people like Fran began writing more about the diversity of Nantucket. And I can't say there wasn't a little bit of pushback at the beginning, that there wasn't a feeling like, well, let's not expose some of the ugly side of our history. But once the local community began to recognize it, then I think they fully embraced it. So now, the NHA fully wants to give the story of Nantucket. And so that's a really good thing.
I think that's funny to think of the wanting to stray away from the ugly side of history, but the story that's being told is the story about the slaughter of whales.
Yeah.
In a very triumphant way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
and also the story, the myth that we've been handed down that the Quakers were all abolitionists. It's incredibly untrue. There were abolitionists very early in the abolition movement. A lot of Quakers were leaders in that. But as time went on, and the abolition movement got more radical, more radicalized, more outspoken, the Quakers, the vast majority of Quakers, were uncomfortable with that because they were not comfortable with expressing outwardly and being part of the whole community. There was the Quakers really wanted to be a part in many ways. And so as the abolition movement became, if you will, more strident, there was pushback against that. And so Lucretia Coffin Mott, for example, was not a mainstream Quaker. She was a Hicksite Quaker, which was an offshoot of the Quakers and always a minority. And so that is a myth that kind of we have to keep working against that. Not that it's a bad thing, necessarily, but it is not true that most abolitionists were Quaker or most Quakers were abolitionists.
Was there slavery in Nantucket?
Pardon me? Oh, there was slavery in Nantucket, absolutely. If you go through the deeds, you'll see slaves with one name handed down and transferred as property. And there's another myth on Nantucket that slavery ended with the freeing of the court case about Prince Boston, who sued for his wages on board a whale ship, and that when I first started studying this, it was just common knowledge. In 1770, slavery ended on Nantucket. Well, it turned out with a bit of digging, that was not really true. Some people in the Boston family, for example, they weren't going to be manumitted until they reached a certain age. And so slavery lingered on for at least a few more years after that. So yes, I mean, it was never a thriving economy here for slaves, but there were enslaved people here, mostly as domestics.
What do you think it was like for Anna when she left Nantucket? We talk about isolation and to just see a part of the world that was so different.
It was incredibly brave. I mean, here she was in her 40s at a time when that was not young, and she went down south in 1862 or maybe early 1863, when it became evident that there was a vast need for teachers of freedmen. So she went on military transport down to New Bern, North Carolina, as a volunteer for the New England Freedmen's Aid Society. They did provide her with a salary, but she was a volunteer. And she was assigned to teach freedmen. And when she first went into her classroom, there were people from ages 4 to 90, and they just clamored for education. And so she was teaching in a very small building in New Bern and quickly realized that there had to be some system to categorize them. And so began what was at those times, relatively new thinking, which was to grade people. In other words, put them into various grades, not just in a one-room setting. And so she began, which was kind of revolutionary at the time, dividing them up and then trying to find people in the Black community who could already read and write. And there were some. For one, there were free Blacks living in New Bern who did know how to read and write. And there were always formerly enslaved people who had learned to read and write, a la Frederick Douglass, illegally or always illegally. And so she was thrust into, occupied territory where the local whites were never welcoming. And often she lived for the first few years in New Bern, and then later when she moved to Charlottesville, she lived with military protection. And she was the average freedman's teacher that came from the north and went down south was in their 20s. She was 46 when she started. The average teacher lasted 2 years. She lasted at least a dozen. she had was very rare in that she'd already taught Black students. She'd taught them when she was a teenager in a private school on Nantucket, and then she later was teacher of record at the African Meeting House School on Nantucket. So she was already aware that there was no disparity between, their educational capability and anyone else's. So she didn't go with sort of that maternalistic, paternalistic attitude that a lot of teachers went down south and said, well, I'm here to dispense my knowledge to these poor people. She did not have that attitude at all. And so she really, truly was unusual and atypical for the average teacher. From New Bern, she went to Charlottesville, Virginia. Again, she went all by herself. She went, by then the Civil War was ended, but the South was occupied by the Union Army. So she moved into a barracks because white people in Charlottesville would not let her board at their house. So she started a school, again, from the ground up, all by herself. And there were hundreds of people who wanted to be educated. And there she was by herself. So within 24 hours, she identified, or possibly the other way around, a formerly enslaved woman named Isabella Gibbons knew how to read and write, and immediately she and Anna formed a team. And that was really where her most significant contribution was. She started a school called the Jefferson School, which there is now a tribute to Anna and the Jefferson School Heritage Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, where they have a full-size mural, like 15 feet long, to Anna and her students. So they still keep alive the legacy of Anna Gardner down there more than we do. If you go into Charlottesville, people have heard of Anna Gardner.
Wow.
So she's created a school there. The school had its windows broken. The Klan visited and put a picture of a coffin outside her door. White students from the University of Virginia would bang on their windows and doors to scare them. When the military pulled out of Charlottesville, Anna took the train to Washington to try to get the Army to change its mind because she felt that they would be burned out and they would be vulnerable without the military. They did not change their minds. They did pull the military out. The teachers stood waving their white handkerchiefs as the soldiers pulled out, leaving them to fend for themselves. But they did. They didn't turn tail and run, even though Felina Karkin said that Anna said to her she was often terrified. What Anna did, and what her main contribution in the South was, she created what was called a normal school class, which was a class for professionally teaching teachers. Not just, okay, you went to a school, so therefore you are qualified to be a teacher, but actually teaching methodology of teaching. And she created a cadre of African-American teachers who kept teaching alive in Charlottesville well into the 20th century. Graduates of her school kept what little education was kept alive after Reconstruction. Anna can take a lot of credit for that.
That is really a remarkable legacy.
Yeah, she was very brave.
Yeah. What did it feel? When did you go down south?
Oh, I went down, I got a grant from UMass Boston called the James Bradford Ames Grant. And I went for 5 weeks by myself. And I went to all the places she was, that she taught. When I got to New Bern, where she first taught, I really encountered a wall. The archivist there was not particularly welcoming, did not really believe there had been much of a presence of freedmen's schools there. And I really had to dig. I really didn't come. I was there for a week and I really did not come back with much. I did come back with a feeling about, there was a now extinct city called James City that was created on the outskirts of New Bern by freedmen. And as soon as I read about that, I just had this feeling like, okay, I think Anna was here. And I did not find the evidence of it then. It took years of digging and other people's research as well before I was able to piece that together, that she did live there. and how difficult that must have been because they came under enemy fire, because they were a camp outside the city. Smallpox ravaged the community, which similar to our pandemic now. In fact, for a while, the teachers had to suspend their classes. Anna had to return to Nantucket for a while because the schools were closed before the smallpox dissipated and she could go back. So that was interesting. And then I went to the University of Virginia, and it was a whole other story. At the time, you had to read microfilm. So I spent, terrible hours scrolling through microfilm of the Freedmen's Bureau records, which are still, I believe, mostly only on microfilm. And there's just rows and rows of them. And I really didn't know where to start. I just randomly pulled things out from Virginia, which could be Raleigh. I mean, it was the whole state. And I was able to, in 1 week, get some material about the Charlottesville school. Not enough. But they were very welcoming, and I found Felina's journal. They found it. I transcribed it. I typed the whole thing up. I have pages on my computer. Now, of course, it's all online, but oh well, back then. And I went to Camden, South Carolina, where she was. Again, found very, very little, but I did come across some, and their archivists there found some things. And then I just came back, and I read, lots of primary source material, the Liberator, the Freedmen's Record. I went up to all the New England Freedmen's Aid Society archives are at the Mass Historical Society. They are now digitized. They weren't at the time. I read boxes of primary source material, which I actually prefer because you can scan a page with your eyes a lot easier. Now they're all digitized, which I actually find more difficult. When I've gone back to check things, it's like, this is hard. Then a couple of years ago, about 4 years ago, my husband and I went back. We went to all the other places because we wanted to see what new things could have been found in the about 10, 12 years difference. And not only did I find more things, but the archivists were welcoming. The same man who had kind of stonewalled me in 2004 came to me. I had written to him ahead of time saying we were coming. He had set some material aside. He found a photo of teachers, which we can't prove definitively Anna's one of them. But if you look at the profile, it's kind of grainy. I'm 90% sure it's a picture of Anna, and he was as excited as I was. And then I went to Charlottesville. I was invited to speak twice, once at the American Heritage Society, and in Camden. The archivist there just couldn't wait to help me. And so that was really wonderful. I'm so glad I went back. And I hope that with this book, when the pandemic passes, that I will be able to go and speak at all of the places Anna lived. So that was really great. And thank you for the James Bradford Ames grant, which is given by a Nantucket woman. She doesn't live here anymore. Adele Ames, whose husband was one of the early chemists, PhD chemist, African-American at Harvard. So she has left a grant at UMass Boston, which is to study Nantucket, the Cape, and I think the Vineyard now, and maybe the Cape. They've expanded it to Cape Verdean and African-American history. So I was really lucky, and it wasn't a huge grant, but it certainly paid for my lodging. So it was a good thing.
Wow. That's great. I love that you got to go back and kind of.
I am so glad I went back because I was left a little bit with a distaste, bad taste in my mouth from my first reception of being like, who is this woman from the North trying to dig up this Black history, and that they didn't really think existed. And now they're like, we want more. We want, did you find out more, so that's great.
Wow.
Do you mind?
Are there any?
I was going to say, do you mind if I interrupt for a second?
No, go ahead.
Because I have to, after listening to this whole chapter of Anna Gardner in the South, my youngest daughter, who's in high school, is now working on a large paper on the civil rights movement, and she's got a great history teacher, and so she's digging on primary sources, and one of her primary sources is a guy named David Goodman, whose brother Andrew Goodman was one of the young men who went down south to register black voters during the Civil Rights Movement and was killed by the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, he was. Oh.
And as I hear this, it really sounds like 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement, these Nantucketers, Anna Gardner, and others in your writing, who I've read, were basically like the civil rights leaders of the 1960s, 100 years earlier. And they were going down south, and it wasn't voting rights then, but it was educational rights. The parallel's unbelievable to me.
Well, it was voting rights, because when, before the Confederate States could come back into the Union, they had to write new constitutions. And so there were a lot of voting rights. Some of Anna's students, black students, became legislators in some of those early, in the Virginia, when they wrote the new constitution for Virginia. And so they did try to register people to vote. They used a lot of the same techniques that the civil rights movement used later: boycotts, letters to the editor, petitions to various places, economic boycotts. Anna had a very visible tussle with the editor of one of the newspapers in Charlottesville, who accused her of being a sociologist and trying to promote equality. And she wrote him back and said, well, yes, I am. There were judicial routes that they tried to file suits. And there was some measure of the success in the 1870s. But then the nation's perspective changed. And as we got away from the Civil War, there was resentment against what they called waving the bloody flag. Let's get the war behind us. Let's move westward, and the Industrial Revolution. And there was an impatience with, let's stop talking about the Civil War. And so the focus shifted, and that's when the Confederates the white Southerners were able to reestablish their white supremacy. But there was that brief shining moment of the 1870s where, one of Anna's friends in Camden was a black man named Frank Adamson, and he was a legislator in the Columbia government in North Carolina, and they were a majority. They were a black voting majority for a while, and some of them had great positions of power, and so we can take some hope or some lessons from them, and their techniques were, equally used by Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So I'd like to join the conversation, because at this point, if we were doing this in the Athenaeum, now is about the time we would open it up to the audience. So
You're the audience surrogate.
I'm the audience at the moment.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask a couple of things. As I was looking forward to hearing you two talk, I started reading your previous book, Barbara, A Line in the Sand, The Battle to Integrate Nantucket Public Schools, 1825 to 1847. And as someone who's read a little bit of Nantucket history, especially a couple of Nat Philbrick's great books on whaling and the society, I really had, very little idea of this or no idea of the battle to integrate the public schools. And right off the bat, just in the first pages, I learned so much about Nantucket that is relevant to Nantucket today, or at least inspiring to people on Nantucket, and actually all over the country because of some of the people you brought to life. So I just want you to, I was so struck. There was one particular story, and I know you, in this conversation, you've alerted us to the fact that Nantucket wasn't packed with abolitionists. There was a divide, but they had very strong voices for abolition. And I was really struck by the story of this escaped slave and his wife. So this couple who had escaped from the South, come to Nantucket, built a life for themselves, and then the slave catcher comes to get them. Yeah. Please tell us that story.
Yeah. And, it was always the law in this country that fugitive slaves, being property, had to be returned. And that was the law. And the law changed throughout time. But when Arthur Cooper, whose original name was George, changed his name when he came through New Bedford and then to Nantucket. He settled on Nantucket as a laborer. He had a house on Angola Street, and he was married to Mary, who was maybe a slave, enslaved, and maybe a free woman. We don't really know for sure. But when the slave hunters came to Nantucket to get him and his family, because any descendant of an enslaved person was a slave as well. So even though Cooper's children had been born in the North, they were technically supposed to also be returned to enslavement. So they came, and of course they stayed at a boarding house, and of course rumor on Nantucket gets out really quickly, especially back then. You know, the town was more compact, and so everyone in town knew that slave hunters had come to get Arthur Cooper and his family. And so when they showed up at the Cooper house in the morning, there was a crowd of African Americans outside to try to prevent them, and the white community was alerted. We don't exactly know the mechanics of that, but our Magistrate Folger showed up at the front door and asked to see their papers, and delaying tactics, which we all can identify with. And then several people, including Oliver Gardner and Thomas Macy, went to the back door, spirited the Cooper family out. It's not a terribly far as the crow flies from Angola Street to Vestal Street, which is where the Gardners lived, which at the time was called Prison Lane because of the prison on it. And so they spirited them to the Gardner house, where Arthur Cooper and his wife and 3 children were hidden in the basement for weeks anyway. And Anna Gardner was only 6 years old, and she remembered almost 60 years later, when she wrote her memoir, the fear that she felt from the Cooper family. In addition, Mary was 9 months pregnant and gave birth to a child during that time period, just to add to the drama. You know, I think it's a foundational episode in Anna Gardner's life, in that she saw her parents go out on a limb and break the law, hide the family. Interestingly, the bounty hunters gave up pretty quickly and left, but they kept the Coopers hidden for a while because they didn't know how determined they would be, and they never did return. And Arthur Cooper became very instrumental in the Zion Church that is no longer here, but it was on the hill by the windmill. And he's buried at the cemetery.
Mary, anything else you want to wrap up?
Final words. I guess they would just be, let me get myself situated better. Final words would be to read Disturber of Tradition, a portrait of Anna Gardner.